Coffee.
Well, if no one's gonna drink this, maybe I'll just... Ugh, that's terrible. That's...
Good morning. This is Morning Coffee with the Chief. I am your host, Patrick Jordan, retired law enforcement officer after 38 years. I also come from a family of law enforcement. So law enforcement has been part of my life for my whole life. And today we have a fantastic show. We're going to go over The Onion Field, which is a true story. It was a book written by Joseph Wambaugh, and I'll get into that in a little bit. But I wanted to talk a little bit, before I bring my guests on, I know that our listeners get a lot of, you see that I get a lot of guests from the LA County Sheriff's Department. Just to clarify who the LA County Sheriff's Department is or what organization, it's the largest sheriff's department in the country. It currently has 18,000 employees. So I'm able to draw on a pool of very talented folks, and I bring interesting people on who've done things interesting in their career or after they've retired. And so my goal is to spread my guests out and get some more people from around the country, but I am blessed that I have this great pool of friends on the LA County Sheriff's Department to tap into for me and for you. But before we get on to our show, I really want to plug the Los Angeles Mission, losangelesmission.org. The LA Mission services the homeless at Skid Row. It is probably the densest concentration of homeless people in any urban environment in Los Angeles. They've existed for 85 years. They do several different kinds of missions. First, they meet the needs of people who are on the streets and still want to stay on the streets by feeding over 400,000 meals a year. They'll give them a warm bed for the night if they want a warm bed. They'll give them a place to shower and get some basic services so they can survive on the streets. You know, that is usually by their choice. Many of them are suffering from addiction and mental health issues or other medical issues. And when those folks are ready to get off the streets, they'll give them wraparound services. They'll invite them in. They'll give them a bed for 6 to 12 months. And they'll work really hard on integrating them back into society. Now, the LA Mission is faith-based. They get zero money from government, which is why I am appealing to you. The Los Angeles Mission does a great job. They're not restricted by government regulation. They've been very impactful. I was at a meeting this past week, and I asked them, well, how do we set ourselves apart from the failure of government? And they're going to put a dashboard that shows the data and success for their efforts on their website. So go to the losangelesmission.org, make a donation, pay attention, and do what you can to help the homeless in Los Angeles. Even if you're not from LA, this is the shame of our country these days is all these homeless folks. And I personally think it's public policy that holds us back. Okay, so let's get into our show here. What I really want to do is, before I introduce the show, I want to introduce our guests. And the very first guest I'm going to introduce is retired Sergeant Danny Kuhn. Now, Danny he retired, I think about 10 years ago. He can clarify that, but he retired as a sergeant. But Danny, in his afterlife, that's after the Sheriff's Department, he wrote about a very important subject, and that's PTSD. Now, this movie and the book that inspired this movie, of course, the true events that inspired this movie, talked a lot about PTSD, which is why I wanted Danny on the show. And let Danny introduce himself and plug his book. Hey, Danny, good morning.
Morning, Pat, and how are you today?
I'm doing well. Excited to have you on.
Good. My name's Danny Kuhn. I'm a retired sergeant, as Pat said, from the Sheriff's Department. I spent 31 years, and 30 of those 31 years I spent as a patrol deputy or assigned to a patrol station. And about 4 years ago, I started blogging about post-traumatic stress injury and law enforcement issues and in the mental health issues. And recently I published a book called Broken, B-R-O, semicolon K-E-N. And it is basically a combination of my blogs that is the who, what, when, where, and how you get, or how you're affected by post-traumatic stress. And, I talk about the book, and I gave you the name. It's broken with a semicolon in it. Grammatically, the semicolon is used when an author could have chosen to end their sentence, but chose not to. But in the mental health arena, the semicolon represents hope for those who have suicidal ideation as a means to persuade them to keep going on. It's just a visual reminder that, hey, I have issues and this is what I'm going to do. Instead of stopping life, I'm going to continue on and march forward.
Just to clarify, as I bring Danny on, and I'll bring my other guest on in a minute here, the sheriff's department is so large, there's times that you can run across somebody that worked for the sheriff's department the same time you did, put 30 years in, and you never meet them. That's just how large the sheriff's department is, and the county's 4,000 square miles. So Danny and I have never worked together, but we probably crossed paths here and there because I recognize you. I just don't think we ever actually worked at the same place. So let's bring up our second guest. This is Danny R. Smith. So you guys are going to have to work really hard on separating Sergeant Danny Kuhn and Detective Danny R. Smith. Detective Smith is retired homicide investigator from the LA County Sheriff's Department, but he's also a noted author. He has several books that are out and about. We'll give him a chance to plug here. He worked for the Sheriff's Department. He actually came on after me. We talked about this, and he retired before me. So he got in and out real quick. And he has his own stories about PSD, which let him bring up what he wants to bring up. But first of all, Danny, say good morning and say hello to our folks, and also introduce yourself and your books.
Good morning, Chief. Good morning, Danny. Good morning to the audience. So I'm Danny R. Smith, and I did 21 years with the Sheriff's Department, and all 21 years were spent in the fast lane. So, it flew by, and it seemed like a quick career, but man, the mileage is what brought me down. And basically, I spent my entire career. The patrol was all in South Central Los Angeles, and then I worked special investigations for about a year before I went to homicide. And I finished my career out at homicide. But when I left the department, I was diagnosed with chronic PTSD. And the last year or so of my career was a real struggle. Like, I felt like I wore cement shoes and just trudged through life. And my wife had noticed it and made a lot of comments, over that year. And she thought I was depressed. And, of course, I kept blowing that off and saying, I'm just burned out. I'm tired. Homicide's an extremely demanding job, as you guys know. And you put in just a ridiculous amount of hours and sometimes work around the clock, for 2-3 days straight. So I just felt like I was tired and burned out. But it turned out when the end came, it came in kind of a dramatic fashion, and there was no doubt that I needed to go. I'd hit the wall, and I couldn't go another 2 steps. And I wrote about it. I've got 8 published novels, and 2 years ago I published my memoirs, and that book is called Nothing Left to Prove. And it's a very heavy book. It's interesting. Anyone that likes true crime, they'll like that. There's a lot of different cases there discussed, and some of the cases everyone's going to know about. But the first chapter alone, I tell people, I give you a 1-chapter challenge. You can go onto Amazon and read the first chapter for free. Actually, the first 2 or 3 chapters, but the first chapter, I think it's a good hook. It have people saying, "Oh my God, I got to see what happened," because the first chapter says, "Hey, my last day with the Sheriff's Department," and I won't give the rest away, but it ended dramatically. So I've got some experience with the PTSD. I've managed it over the years, and it's actually how I became an author. And I'll save that for later conversation. But But I started writing because writing is therapeutic, and that's what helped me in the healing process. So
Yeah,
thanks for having me as a guest there, Chief.
no problem, no problem. So you can hear we have some great guests here, and let's jump into our show because we'll have a chance to talk. I have a lot of scenes I got to go over. It's a 2-hour show, so it sometimes makes it a little hard. So let me introduce the movie. The movie is The Onion Field. Now, The Onion Field, this movie is based upon a book by the author Joseph Wambaugh, who's a retired LAPD lieutenant and started writing while he was still working, I believe. And he's written, oh God, dozens of novels by now, or short stories that have gone on to be made into movies, both fictional and true life. I think he did another true life one, Lines and Shadows, I think it was a true life book about the border. And so he's done a few that are, and I think The Blooding, I read the one called The Blooding where he talked about the first use of DNA in England, which was a great book as well. So he's an excellent author, and a lot of his stuff's been made into movies or television shows. It also stars some great guys. John Savage, which we were talking about before the show started. He starred in Deer Hunter. That's probably the most notable role that I remember him from. And then James Woods, what an interesting guy. He always seems to play the same character, but he plays a really good narcissistic bad guy in the show. And we'll talk to Danny Smith about that in a little bit here because I just loved his interview, right? Which wasn't much of an interview. Franklin Seals, who plays Jimmy Lee Smith, and Ted Dancing, a very young Ted Dancing before he starred on Cheers. So and if you watch the show, you're going to see Christopher Lloyd. He's a jailhouse lawyer later on in the show. So those are probably the most notable actors that are in the movie that I recognized. Let's see, I'm looking for my director. Oh, Harold Becker was the director of this movie. So any comments before we start doing some slide scenes? Danny Smith, did you like the movie?
Yeah, well, I don't know if I'd say I like the movie. I'll tell you, it's interesting. I first read the book before I became a deputy sheriff, like maybe a year before I became a deputy. And I found it extremely interesting on a number of fronts, especially, at the stage where I was about to embark on this career in law enforcement. And I read it again shortly after I retired, and it was very hard to get through. Like now I had all this baggage with me. I've got all these dead colleagues and these homicide scenes and these, terrible things that are now part of who I am. And it wasn't entertaining. I did read it all the way through, but it just was tough, man. It was a difficult read that next time through after my career was over. And then, of course, when you asked me to be on the show and then told me what we were going to be discussing, I was like, oh God, and I did. I watched it. I'd seen the movie before. It had been, decades probably, but I watched it, and it's a tough thing for me to watch, and I don't like it. I mean, it's obviously it's a good movie, but it's kind of like, I always wonder why my dad wouldn't ever watch war movies, and he was in war, and he doesn't like war movies. So I think that's kind of the parallel there.
I think it's a true life story, but you're constantly, as you watch it or you read the book. My dad retired from Detroit Police as a lieutenant. He was big in the Wambaugh, so I ended up reading a lot of his books as a young man, even before I got in the sheriff's department. But as you read this book or you watch the movie, we're constantly thinking, well, what if he'd have just done this, if he'd done, and that is what you go through after you live through one of these things. What if I did this? What if I did that? And it's not really logical, but it is, those are the emotional responses you have. And you have it when you read somebody else's story as well. Danny Kuhn, what do you think?
Well, the first time I read the book was in 1975 when it was released. I was 16 years old. I was a law enforcement explorer. And I looked at it in a different view. I looked at it as a cop killing. I didn't see all the behind the scenes stuff that I see now. And then a couple of years later, when I started college, I had to read the book as an assignment. Then I joined the Army, probably read the book 1 or 2 times in the Army, read it again when I got out of the Army and back in school as another assignment. And in 1979, when the movie came out, one of the places where it debuted was the Orange Theaters in the city of Orange, in Orange, California. And I went there and stood in line outside in the cold with about a couple of hundred other coppers, and watched the movie then. And one of the things we talked about is James Wood. For the longest time after I saw the movie, I couldn't watch a James Wood movie because I identified him as Gregory Powell. And Gregory Powell is, he's just straight out evil. But I've read the book probably a dozen times, seen the movie just as many times. Just in the last week, I've watched it twice. So
Yeah.
It's a subject matter that I'm pretty good at, I guess. And, I'm a big Wambaugh fan, and he's written, you said too, I think he's got about 4 true story novels out there, and they're really interesting. And the way he writes and paints a word picture is amazing. In regards to this, Wambaugh, he was working as a detective sergeant. He took a 3-month leave of absence and spent $800,000 to make the movie. He had, I think their budget was like $2 million or $3 million, and he had to raise all the money himself because he couldn't get any studio that would write it the way he wanted to write it, and or film it the way he wanted to film it. They wanted different endings and stuff, and he goes, "No, this is a true story. This is how it has to be written and has to be filmed." So that's what made it more fun and more interesting. The backstory of this whole thing is amazing. So, and we'll get into that.
Yeah, let's get into that. Let's do the, can you throw up Wambaugh's book cover there, Martin, so the audience can see? Do you have it available? So there it is, Joseph Wambaugh, The Onion Field. So it was written obviously before the movie, and it addresses the murder of Ian Campbell in 1963. His partner at the time was Officer Carl Hettinger. And so it's an excellent book. There's more in the book than in the movie because there's limitations on the media, movie media, when they tell that story. But it is pretty true to the book. He stays true to the story, which is what I really like, because it also, you don't really understand that PTSD stuff. Most people don't if they haven't gone through it. They don't understand it. But as I watched the movie and certainly read the book, I read it before I was a cop, so I didn't understand it then. But later on, obviously, I see the movie and I understand it. So let's get up to the first scene, and this is where the partners meet. And he's down in the basement, and Ian Campbell, and I'll get a chance to talk about Bagpipes because that was a big part of my life in law enforcement as well. But he goes down into the basement, Carl Hettinger does, to meet his partner, Ian Campbell, and he's playing the bagpipes down there. And I'll bring it up now, I guess, I grew up going to memorial services for police or slain police officers, and I remember the bagpipes distinctly, right, as a kid. I think the first time I went, I was 10. And every time there was something like that, and most funerals, particularly in Detroit, there were bagpipes. And then a lot of the ones out here in California involving our counterparts, those people that were slain in line of duty, there's almost always bagpipes there. And it just brings me back to those funerals, or the ones that were most impactful to me. The one I remember is Jack Miller, his funeral. I remember that one distinctly because I went to it, and his little kids were walking up the church. But the bagpipes are important. It takes me right back to every one of those events and brings back those emotions of the death. You probably didn't guess that I would ask about bagpipes, but what do you think, Danny Smith? What do you think of bagpipes and its relationship to law enforcement and tragedy?
Well, that was something I didn't mention in my previous little segment, but that's the other thing that kills me. I can't stand to hear them. I've been to way too many cop funerals, and I've been at too many dead cop crime scenes, and all of it just ties together. And like you said, the bagpipes, it stands for something very specific for guys like us. And same with the 21 gun salute, and I've had several colleagues that were killed in the line of duty, guys that I worked with, and it's just, I can't do it. And I'll tell you, after I went to homicide, I quit going to cop funerals. And the reason why is because then I had to start attending the autopsies of murdered policemen. And once I did that, I said, I only have so much to give. If I have to do this, I'm not going to go to the funerals also. And I've not been to a cop funeral since I went to homicide in 1997. So, Yeah, it's the bagpipes are tough, man. And, there's certain songs that are always played at funerals, The Wind Beneath My Wing. And they come on, and it just brings back a lot of emotion.
Amazing Grace is the one I remember when they
Oh,
played that on the bagpipes. Yeah. Danny Kuhn, what do
yeah.
you think about the bagpipes and bringing back memories?
Yeah, you want to see me cry, play Amazing Grace on a bagpipe. It brings out the first three notes. It brings out tears. In the fire service and police service, bagpipes have a solid foundation. Last August, I officiated my younger brother's funeral, and here's this big bad deputy sheriff up on the stage, and they start playing the San Bernardino County Fire Department drum and bagpipes. They started playing Amazing Grace, and I just lost it. So I like listening to it. It's an interesting instrument, but I, along with Danny Smith, I don't go to police officers' funerals because they're hard to handle. The last live funeral I went to was Rick Hammock, and that was back in '91. And I've live streamed a couple of them, but I don't go to them because it's just too emotional and too painful.
So I'm kind of, the reason why I wanted to bring that up is because when you have PSD or you have all those memories, and simple things like bagpipes bring all those emotions back to you, and most people won't understand that. Now, growing up as a kid, I also used to watch these guys at the St. Patrick's Day Parade, so I have both positive memories of bagpipes and negative memories, right? So it's kind of a mixed thing. But for a lot of folks who didn't grow up with those traditions, it takes you back to that funeral, it takes you back to that death, it takes you back to the memory, and that's what most people don't understand about PSTD. You'd be surprised at what triggers the emotion, and bagpipes can trigger that emotion. Hey, let's bring up Powell and Smith and talk about our career criminals who are so the scene is these guys are getting introduced. They meet each other at some shoe shine stand, which is unusual, right? We don't see that much anymore. They're still around here and there, but it was certainly something that was a little more prevalent in the 60s. Early 60s, and this is a time, and both of you guys can comment on it, but this is a time when we saw accelerating crime in Los Angeles and a lot of our major cities. We came out of the 50s into the 60s, and we saw an increase in crime. It was pretty dramatic, and we'll get into it later. But also revolving door justice. There was a time when we also focused on treatment and other avenues for dealing with crime versus incarceration. The corrections for custody came around usually around this time. There were reforms back then, and so, but these guys are career criminals. They both talked about just getting out of prison. Now they're on the streets, and they're already talking about what their next score is going to be or what they're going to do. And I wanted to hit Danny Smith on this. What the interesting thing about Powell and his character is he's just a narcissist, right? He thinks he knows everything. And when you did interviews of suspects, did you find that this is like a common trait with a lot of them? Is this something that is not unusual?
Oh, no, it's definitely not a common trait with them. I've certainly encountered a few narcissists and people with personalities like Powell's, but it's not the norm. I don't know. It's funny. Killers kind of come in all kinds of packages, and of course I've sat and spent many hours with hundreds of them. But I would say that Powell is unique, or was. His personality traits were very, very unique, and it's an interesting, and that's what makes this story so interesting is how he was kind of able to manipulate Jimmy Smith into doing the things that they did.
And that's a big part of this. He is from the moment he meets him, he's already looking for a new partner. He wants to jettison his old partner, who's drinking too much, and he wants somebody new, and he sees that in Smith right away, and that manipulation starts right away. Now, you've had a lot of two defendant cases. It's not unusual for one defendant to manipulate another. Would that be true?
Yeah, it's certainly true. And in this case, the Onion Field, one of the things that they did is they were they appealed the case and asked for separate trials. And that's a pretty common thing. I've had a lot of cases where they do that, and it gets man, I'll tell you what, the justice system is one of the things that wears a guy down, honestly. And probably not only law enforcement officers, but all the other people in the justice system, the attorneys. But they wear you out, and one of the things that they can do is they separate the trials, and then you go through this maze of trying to figure out what can be used in one trial and what can't be used in the other, and it just makes it that much more difficult to prosecute people. And it's not easy to prosecute people to begin with. Truthfully, it's not. So, I think, in fact, in the movie, at one point, I believe it was one of the attorneys that said, he goes, I just wish they'd let them both out and I could be done with this. I mean, that's how frustrated he had become, that he was, I'm sure, he said it in jest, but he said out loud that, he wished they'd just let these two cop killers walk out so that he didn't have to deal with it anymore. And that's just it's exemplifying the frustration that people in the justice system often feel.
Well, I think you bring up a point that that I've been trying to make on the stage. When I got asked to host the show, I said, yeah, I want to review movies, but I also want to talk about the realities of police work, my own experiences, the experiences of my guests, and then what's going on today. There is a perception that, we went out and just arrested anybody, and it was really hard to get into jail, is what you're talking about. I mean, there's, unless you committed a serious crime, there's a lot of diversion efforts. We cut you out. We give you, there's second, third, fourth, and fifth chances for these guys. It's not easy. And then when you got a good case on them and they know the system, as you're talking about, I mean, I was an investigator for about a year, and then I ended up being a lieutenant in charge of investigative units, which was a lot easier than being an investigator. I will admit, Danny, I think the detectives worked harder than the lieutenants, but we got all the glory on it. But yeah, you have to chase down witnesses. You're constantly struggling, and they're delaying the case simply to make it harder for you to put that case together. And they use every nut and bolt of the criminal justice system that benefits them. And so here we are today. We had a lot of protection for offenders, criminals who committed crimes in the past, but now there are even more protection. There's a lot more transparency of law enforcement. There's a lot more accountability, as they call it, and they decreased the authority of law enforcement and increased the administrative burden, which made it even harder to put people in jail than it was before. And you retired 10 years ago, so it was already hard even before Prop 47 and all these other reforms. Now it's even harder, which is why we see crime going up. Danny Coons, what do you think of that comment? Do you agree with that, or anything to add?
Oh, I agree with it. Watching the meet and greet between Powell and Smith, it's very apparent that Powell is a psychopath. And I really love the comment that Jimmy Smith made, is he came from Vacaville. That's a nut prison or a crazy prison. And that's the truth. You watch this whole movie or read the book, it's Powell wasn't dealing with a straight deck. He was actually extremely intelligent, but smart people don't have that correct frame of mind to do the things. And I always used to say, and Danny, I think you can agree with me, is the time and effort that a lot of criminals put into their misdoings. If they put that into doing something that is right, they'd be gazillionaires.
Yeah. If I could comment on what Danny Kuhn just said, he was an interesting guy. You call him a psychopath. I'd call him a sociopath. And one of the things that stands out about him is, he literally just executed a policeman, and, it's probably within an hour he's pulled over by the highway patrol. And he's so cool as a cucumber, and he just goes through the motions and tries to, he's got his story, and he really tries to sell it to these cops. And those guys did a great job of putting a few pieces together and saying, this isn't right. This guy's dirty. But, all of us, we know when you catch a guy that's pretty fresh from a scene, usually those guys are so jacked up that right away that something's wrong. But he was a smooth operator, and that's one of the signs of being a sociopath. He literally could shoot someone in the face, a policeman, shoot him in the face, and calmly stand in front of two other policemen an hour later and, hey guys, how are you doing? Yeah, here's my driver's license. Oh, did I mess up the registration? I mean, it's insanity.
He started planning that as soon as he started his escape plan, which was interesting, because you're right, a lot of people are panicked. But I got the interesting thing about this, and most people don't understand law enforcement, is there are things that are out of place, which causes you to ask more questions. And what I loved about that scene that you're talking about, Danny Smith, is they find the irrigation shovel. Okay, you ain't from
Yep.
LA or wherever he's from. This is a
Yeah.
local car. You stole it. This was stolen from here. And it's little things like that people won't understand that are, okay, that's the thread that say this guy's lying. That's the thread. I'm gonna look deeper into this guy. And I really like that part of the scene. What do you think, Danny Kuhn? Danny, what do you think?
I agree. The thing that's funny is the car was registered, he said to his parents, and it's registered in Oceanside. And the highway patrolman, they probably equated Oceanside with the beach.
Yeah.
But Oceanside actually has a large farming community. I live in Oceanside, and you got a couple of miles of the beach, but once you get inland, it's a lot of agriculture. So, but it was a great observation on saying this isn't right, that's not right. Yeah. And what I got a kick out of Powell, and as the highway patrolman's going into the trunk, Powell is sitting there looking at his gun, just looking at the butt handle of his gun, waiting for an opportunity to grab it. Yeah. And I have seen that so many times in my career. Is just you'll watch a bad guy and you'll watch over if your partner's doing something he shouldn't be doing. I had a trainee that leaned into a car one time and just left his gun within reach of our bad guy who had his hand on the hood. And that's scary. And he was actively thinking, okay, I'm cool as a cucumber, as Danny Smith said, but we'll take this guy out if you give me half a chance.
Yeah, I've heard that before, where a guy shoots a cop and he says, well, he was slipping, so I took my chance, right? I took my opportunity because he was slipping. He wasn't doing it right. He got sloppy. I've heard that before. And so let's move on to the next scene. I think,
Chief.
Yeah.
Before we move on the next scene, I have queued up 4 very good questions. I don't know if you want to.
Okay, yeah, let's see. What throw them up there.
First, we have this.
What percentage of LA population is homeless these days? So I can't give you a percentage, but I can say the last time I looked at the number, it's about 70,000 homeless population, but just a few years ago was at 40,000. And that's for LA County, and it's accelerating. Now, I personally think it's accelerating because we let a lot of people out of prison without any support. And I think if they actually did a study, and I challenged them when I was still working, we need to look at how many people came out of state prison, because LA County ships about 1/3 of the people to CDCR, or at least we used to before George Gascon. And when they cut out all those, when they released 100,000 inmates, or how many they released out, 1/3 of them are coming back to LA. And I did kind of a correlation. If you looked at the increase in homeless population and you looked at the increase or the people released back to LA County from state prison, it was almost within 1,000 the same number. So I think, and when I challenged one of the members of the Board of Supervisors that we need to track this, they rejected that assumption, because to me, they don't want to know what the issue is. But there are lots of people on Skid Row who are they're just addicted to drugs, and places like the LA Mission give them an opportunity to get off drugs. I don't necessarily agree with all of the government programs out there, because I think they're driven more by ideology and not by evidence-based programs. So I will say we're at probably about 70,000 people in LA County, and it's probably about 55,000 in LA City alone. Hope that answers your question.
Okay, we have this one.
Okay, how do you fellas feel about certain individuals who have suicidal ideologies for 20 years or more and have not acted on them in any ways? I mean, I don't know if you're talking about our compatriots, our partners, but we'll get into talking about suicides in the course of the show. So hopefully that'll answer your question there, Bosch.
Okay, and we have this one.
You guys think documenting the production and the event helps with healing some of the trauma? Yes, I do think, as including the triggers of reenactment. I think talking about it and writing about it, I started talking about stuff and opening up about my own issues, and they pale in comparison to both of my guests. But I think writing and talking about them is helpful? What do you think, Danny Kuhn? Is talking about it all and writing about it is helpful, right?
Very helpful. The reason I started blogging is as a therapy. Just like Danny Smith started writing his novels as a form of therapy, I blog as a form of therapy. And for the active duty, talking about it is a great thing. We came from a very large department that has an excellent psychological services bureau. Most police departments, most first responder agencies don't have that access that we had. And one of the things research has shown over the last couple of years is peer support is very important. Just going out after a critical incident and talking to another peer is great. And one of the things we'll get into when we talk about suicide is an organization out there that offers peer support through retired police officers. So,
okay,
talking is great.
Well, let's get on to our next scene. He gives up the gun. I'm going to skip a scene. We'll go right to it. Gives up a gun. I really want to talk about that with you guys. So, and this is the case where these guys stop. These guys already. They're acting suspicious, which I agree. They're both wearing the same leather jackets and hats. Yes, of course they look suspicious. So, obviously Powell's belief that they don't look suspicious actually drew him to them, right? So. And they pull them over, and this is a different time. These guys don't have vests on. They only have one gun. There's no radio. There's a lot of things that they don't have that we took for granted that were luxuries for us. And they're in plain clothes. No indication they're cops other than just announcing who they are and the red light. But I couldn't remember. I couldn't forget. I couldn't help but think about what we were all taught in the academy, and I brought this up in a previous show, Raymond Lewis George. These criminals do practice taking guns away from you. They do practice this kind of stuff. That was a big deal in the academy. We had Deputy Pullman who was killed, and his gun was taken from him. So it really, I don't know if it accelerated after the 50s and into the 60s, but definitely they were practicing this stuff in state prison. And they were looking for opportunities to get the drop on police officers, and that included taking their guns away from them. What do you think, Danny Smith?
Well, I think the 50s certainly was a different time in our country, and by the time the three of us became cops, it was unequivocal. You do not ever surrender a weapon, because let's face it. Probably in the 50s, the reason they didn't carry, backup guns and have to wear vests and everything else is it was a different time, and there weren't as many people that would try to kill a cop. And I think that in today's society, quite frankly, cops have a target on them, and we all know that you never, ever, ever want to put yourself in a situation where you're hoping for mercy. And, I think all of us and most of our colleagues that we all worked with over the decades, we all had the mindset of, if you're going to kill me, you're going to do it here and now, and period. And because I have a better chance to fight, we all have seen, scores or hundreds of people who have been shot and survived. And, our mindset, and I say ours, I think, I could say collectively that most of us, everyone I ever worked with, we all had the mindset of, no, you don't let them waste you, you fight until the very end, and you never surrender and hand over your gun. Now, having said that, like I said, the 50s was a different time, and it is shocking for me to, watch that movie or read the book and realize that one of the cops was saying, hand over your gun. Yeah. It's appalling. It's hard to even accept, but that's, it was a different world back then,
Yeah, I think you remember in the academy, I remember hearing Lieutenant McAndrews or Captain McAndrews, never give up, never surrender. It was a speech. I don't think he gave the speech, but he had a tape of it. He'd worked the academy, and he talked about, you have to, you can never give up. You can never surrender. You always have to keep fighting. And, there is a push against law enforcement's, the warrior spirit that gets instilled in us to some degree. And they think it needs to be more pastoral. I mean, we need to be more like social workers, and we're not. So we are like social workers in a lot of ways. I call myself law enforcement the social workers of last resort because they're all in bed. All the social workers are in bed at 3 o'clock in the morning when we really need them, right? So we're the low social workers last. But also we have to have a little bit of that warrior spirit to survive these challenges. Danny Kuhn, what do you think of that? You agree with that?
Well, you got to look at the 50s and the 60s. At the time in the 50s and into the early 60s, LAPD was coming out of some huge corruption scandals. They were basically a corrupt police department, and they had new leadership, so that was leading them out there. And the thing that gets me the most is both Ian and lost my train of thought there. Both of the officers, Hettinger and Powell, or Hettinger and Campbell, were United States Marines, and their mindset, I just don't get it, because they were a United States Marine who served in Korea. So they should have had some type of warrior spirit. They didn't. And that's what kind of struck me the most. Is I've been around Marines most of my life, and their attitude is never give up, but these guys did. But there's some other interesting things. When this happened, this was their 9th shift working together. So they were brand new partners. They probably didn't know too much more than how do you like your coffee? You know, sweet or not sweet. You know, they didn't have the same cohesiveness as you would if you were working together for a year. And then the mindset then also, within 6 weeks prior to this incident, so from the beginning of February to March 9th, 3 other police officers from LAPD had given up their guns without any consequence. They were held hostage, they gave up their guns, and they were set free. And that was something that they all knew, so they were using that as a tool to get away without getting killed. Unfortunately, in this situation, it didn't work out that way.
You know, I know when I went through the academy and we went to patrol training, that was a discussion I had with my training officer on what the expectations were. And so you're right. You don't necessarily have those conversations right away when you're with a new partner, but there are things that you should talk about all the time. And it obviously got a lot more dangerous for us in the 80s and 90s. If you look back at the data, it was incredibly more dangerous. You know, some of the comments are talking about PTSD is also, you can find that EMT and firefighters, and that is absolutely true. I was at Nixon's library yesterday, and they had a POW exhibit, and our military certainly experiences PTSD. So yes, to the comments regarding PTSD, you can find that in different professions and people who deal with death and destruction. Yes, it happens to them as well. I just think on giving up your gun, it's probably a legacy of this murder that we were all told never to give up your gun, never surrender your gun. I believe that was said in the academy, and that was the attitude. When I hit the streets, I joined in 83 and I hit the streets in 85. So I think I probably beat both of you guys to the streets, and I like Danny Kuhn, I loved patrol, so I did some investigations, but I spent most of my time in patrol because that was my love. I enjoyed it. And I hated chasing witness down with subpoenas there, Danny Smith. So I went back to patrol and enjoyed it because it was a clean day. The next day was a new set of problems. I didn't have to worry about caseloads.
Now, which academy did you go to?
217.
So you were at Pescaloo Center also?
Yeah, it was about 2 months after my 21st birthday. I got hired on.
Yeah, because that was one thing that was beat into us. I came on in 81, and the DIs at the academy beat it into us at Pescaloo Center since it was an active jail. They'd always tell you, see those guys over there? They're watching everything you do. They're learning. They're getting experience and seeing how you do things, and they're going to kill you. That's basically what they were saying.
Yeah,
and that was one thing. And you're right when you. That's what the criminals do. They study what the cops do.
Yeah. They're looking for an advantage, and I just assumed, with who we're dealing with, who you're normally dealing with out there, that they want to get away, and so they got to kill you as a witness, and that happens all the time. Danny Smith, have you ever had a suspect take a victim hostage and then promised that he'll keep them alive and then ultimately kill them? Have you dealt with a case like that?
I have not. No,
I have not. Okay. I want to get into they've been kidnapped, and so this is officers' fears, right? They're kidnapped, they're in the car, they're driving out to Bakersfield. Now I've been in situations, I know you guys have been in situations where you're not completely in control. You're still armed, you haven't given up your gun, but you live through the fear of these situations all the time. We're chasing an armed suspect and you find out you're by yourself, or you're in an apartment and it goes really bad and they're armed and you're in a fight. There is a fear that we lived with, and we kind of mask that lots of times. But I was thinking, these guys, they're in incredible fear right now. They're thinking, how do I survive this? Danny Kuhn, what do you think was going through the officers' minds when they're in this car and they're heading out and wondering how they're going to get out of this thing?
Looking at Campbell, since he's driving, he's kind of focused on the road, but he is also just going through his mind, what's next? What's going to happen? How can I do this? Hettinger in the back seat, he was by himself. And he, I think, was thinking of more tactical of ways to stop this incident. But unfortunately, he never really got the opportunity to use any of the tactics. He probably, one of the things that have come up in Wambaugh had said it, and after writing the book, and I think it came up in the book, is one of the administrators from LAPD says, "What about taking a pencil and ramming it into the side of Campbell's or Smith's head, or what about this, or what?" There was a whole bunch of second guessing afterwards, but they were both definitely, first you say it, then you do it type of thing, and that's what they were doing. So,
I think, Danny Smith, I think that as I got into my career, we started addressing gun takeaways. If somebody's got the drop on you, how to actually take a gun away. We were taught how to protect your own gun and keep that from day one. But we weren't always told, if somebody's got a drop on you, what do you do next? And I really do think our training has progressed. Unfortunately, lots of our trainings are built upon the shoulders of people who have suffered tragedies and made mistakes, and tactically they were not in the right spot. But ultimately, I was taught how to do gun takeaways if I was in that situation. But that's what happens in these law enforcement murders. We learn a lot about the murders. We learned what happened, and then we incorporate that into our new training to teach guys who are under stress how they're supposed to react. Do you agree with that?
Sure. In fact, two things. We had some training in that, and most cops, or a lot of cops, did martial arts of one form or another, and I've done my share, and trained in those types of things. And I mean, I remember practicing with partners with unloaded guns of, certain ways that you could disable a gun when you grabbed it, and how quickly you could grab it before the person could react and pull a trigger. And a lot of people would think that's nonsense, but it's true. If you act fast and you go hard and you're committed, you can do that. If you have that, if you've closed the distance, if you're able to reach out and grab it. So there's that. But I was sitting here thinking about something that is a really good example of the difference in mindset that our generation of policemen had, and that is when George Arthur was killed. He had a man with a gun on him, and I don't know, what George was told to do or what he was told was going to happen. None of us know, but we know one thing for certain. And everyone that knows George Arthur knows that he was absolute warrior. He was a legend on our department. And I worked with him at the jail the night he was murdered, but he left the jail, and there was his killer was lying in wait in the back of his van. And what he did, because he had the mindset of, no, I'm not going to cooperate, and you're probably going to kill me anyway, so I'm going to take you out. And what he did is he accelerated his van into the concrete median where an on-ramp to the freeway was, and he floored it. And he hit that thing as dead center and hard as he could, and it put the killer mostly through the windshield. It brought him up, and he smashed the windshield and left all of his DNA there. And that's how this case was ultimately solved, a case that went unsolved for so long that I actually ended up working on it many years later when I was at Homicide. I was involved in the reinvestigation of that case before it was ultimately solved by Mike Bumcrot and Sean McCarthy. But you know, that's a mindset that I think was prevalent in our generation of police officers, and I think that probably it still is. We know that you can't expect mercy from, you know, the type of people who are going to point a gun in a cop's face. You just can't.
No, and I you know, I really want to get into this subject in terms of your cognitive ability, right? You know, so if you haven't thought through what you're going to do in a tough situation, if you haven't trained your mind, even as for me when I played football, visualization, you visualize what you're going to do when the fullback comes out of the backfield towards you, how you're going to take them down, right? That visualization and what you're going to do is really important for law enforcement, because once you get under stress and your ability to think cognitively decreases when you're under stress, you're going to react how you've trained yourself to react, which is why we talk about these things. And I suspect that probably didn't exist at the time at 63 when this happens. But we learned, right? And that's where we learn on the shoulders of other people who have been through these tough situations and have survived, or who have ultimately sacrificed. Danny, what do you think of your ability to think cognitively, and then you blame yourself for it because you don't really see, I could have done this, I could have done that. But you know what? If you haven't really trained yourself to react in a certain way, you're going to react the way you were trained, period, right? And you can do a lot of what ifs. Yeah.
Unfortunately, you prepare yourself every day before you go to work. I would drive from Ontario to East LA when I worked at East LA. It's a 30-minute drive. And on that 30 minutes, you're just constantly going over different scenarios. I worked early mornings, graveyard shift. So I'm always thinking, what am I going to come across? You know, what's going to happen? How am I going to handle this situation? But unfortunately, what that does to us is it starts the hypervigilance cycle. And that is where probably an hour or two before you start your shift, you start thinking about work and your blood pressure slightly rises up. You start mentally different things. It's explained in my book. Your amygdala starts pumping out different hormones. And by the time you get to work, you're halfway stressed out already. You don't know it. You're pumped up to go to work. And you keep going, your everything is going great. Then at the end of the shift, you get off work, but you just can't turn that cycle off.
No.
And so you have to find a way to calm down. Unfortunately, what a lot of guys do is they know where the closest bar is at 6 a.m. to get a drink. So that's not the right thing to do, but that's unfortunately what a lot of guys do.
Yeah, for me, I used
the
to
negative
run just
side
for
about
myself. Yes.
That's the negative side about building yourself up and thinking about different situations. But you have to do it. So many times I've thought about different things, and a situation actually occurred similar to what I thought about, and it worked out good for me.
Yeah.
And one of the things you talked about being in an apartment by yourself with a bunch of bad guys, that happened to me. And as you're sitting there, you know, fortunately we had handheld radios, and I'm screaming in the radio and holding two guys at gunpoint and just hoping that help gets there. And I was working in Lancaster then, and help was a long ways away.
Yeah, well, you got to train your mind on how you're going to react to that, and then you go to that. You know, I think we have one more time for a scene before our break, and this is Campbell's murder. And you know, I think it's at that moment, you know, they got him out of the car. They don't immediately jump into the car and leave. So you know, clearly they got a plan, and Powell's got a plan. I think Smith is just following his lead here. In fact, Smith dumps his gun. Or that was when they took him hostage. I don't Smith wants to be there at all, but Powell's already made a decision he's going to kill him. You know, they did have an opportunity, but that goes right back to what we're talking about. You got to have a plan. You got to be thinking of a plan, and you got to be thinking, if I get an opportunity, I'm going to get away, or I'm going to disarm these guys, or whatever I'm going to do. And unfortunately, that didn't happen. But they bring up a thing called the Little Lindbergh Law. And I had to do a little research. So after the Lindbergh kidnapping, the Great Flyers kidnapping, they passed federal legislation to make it, I think, a capital case federally. But in California, they did a little differently. They passed state law that if a person's hurt during a kidnapping, it could potentially be a capital case, which wasn't the case in this place at this point until he shot Campbell. So it was his narcissist's lack of understanding of the law helped contribute to the outcome here. Hey, Martin, how much time do I have before break?
Oh, like minute and a half.
A minute and a half. Okay. Hey, Danny Smith. So this misunderstanding of the law that helped to contribute this, their failure to
No,
take
no.
action.
I'm sorry. I was wrong. We have 2 minutes.
2 minutes. Okay. So what do you think of this scene, Danny? Danny Smith. They're waiting for a decision by the suspects. They let the suspects control the tempo in this, and also the misunderstanding of the law, which comes out a little bit later too in the movie.
Yeah, that's a good point, Chief. They did let the suspects dictate everything that happened in this case. They never tried to take control of it, and never took any affirmative action to get away until after Ian was shot. But yeah, it's an interesting part of the story that, you know, this narcissist that thinks he knows everything, Pal, he's convinced that, you know, hey, we've kidnapped these guys, so it's capital punishment anyway. So, you know, we might as well kill the witnesses and hope we get away with it. And, you know, as it's pointed out in the book and the movie, it turns out that wasn't the case. They wouldn't have, until he shot him, there wouldn't have been a capital case. But, you know, I don't know that would have made a difference. Truthfully, I think Pal, he had been itching to kill someone. You know, he bragged about killing other people, which I don't think he had. That's not been explored, at least as far as I know. But he'd make those statements to his partners to impress them. You know, but he also made a bunch of other statements and tried to live this big facade. And I don't know. I just feel like he was itching to shoot someone for a long time, and I think that that's what he wanted to do. And I think that you know, as soon as they got stopped that night, I think that the destination was always going that direction.
Well, I think he was seeking status in that criminal world, which is, you know, and we do have criminals who are like that. They want status, and one of the, obviously, probably not known to the public, you know, one of those things that gives you status in prison is if you killed a police officer.
Yeah.
Is that accurate, Danny? And it sets you apart. You're somebody different, and you get treated differently in custody when you do that. Is that correct?
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry.
Danny Smith, go ahead. We'll get.
No. We need to go to break.
Oh, let's go to break. We'll pick up on the other side.
Hi guys, this is Gary from Pop Culture Minefield here on KGRA, and we're leaving for our first break. I hope we survive.
Did you know 75% of Americans
Hey members, the new KGRA DB app is now available on iOS and Android devices. Gain on-demand access to any KGRA DB programming. Download any show directly to your mobile device to listen or watch on the go. Go to the App Store and search KGRA DB.
Oh wow, we survived. Welcome back to the commercial break. Now for some more Pop Culture Minefield on KGRA.
Welcome back to Morning Coffee with the Chief. I'm your host, Patrick Jordan. I just want to remind folks, if you like the video so far, do me a favor. If you like what you're watching, go on to Pop Culture Minefield.
I'm
Morning
late.
Coffee with the Chief with this video, and like the video. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. If you're watching us on Rumble, remember to follow on the KGRA Rumble channel and like that video, and also share it with a friend. I'm getting some positive comments. Good show for so far. They really like the subject. You know, PTSD is one of those things that we kind of gloss over in law enforcement. But Danny, I left you with a question. Do you remember that question? And you want to respond, Danny Smith?
No, I don't.
You're getting old, Danny.
It's yeah.
Tell me about it.
Well, let's go on to the next scene, because I really it's really interesting when Powell is caught. We already talked a little bit. He's caught pretty quick. He which really tells us he's not the criminal mastermind that he thinks he is, right? And some good police work by, I think it's the CHP in this case, who pulled him over. Obviously, we got broadcast out, so they got a broadcast out right away. The car fit the description, so they kind of knew they had the possibility of a 187 suspect. And that's, they were a little lax in how they approached. Remember, we had that those 4 CHP officers who were murdered up in Newhall, so they were learning as well, right? And so they normally now, if you got somebody that thinks a 187 suspect, you're going to just detain them and get other cars there and take them down, right? That's the new practice. But in this case, they pulled him over, they catch the guy. But the most interesting thing about this scene is right after they catch him, LAPD, the homicide investigator, rolls up there, and I forget the actor's name. I've seen him in a lot of stuff before, but he's a pretty good actor.
Ronnie Cox.
Yeah, he was in Beverly Hills Cop too, right? And he was in
Cop, a couple of movies.
A lot of good movies. A great actor. But what was the most interesting thing about Powell is the investigator barely gets in the room, and Powell rolls over him. Rolls over on his partner, right, and just gives them the goods. He didn't even have to develop a relationship with him, and he just rolls a cigarette. And I'm going to tell you, have you ever had an experience like that where the crime partner just rolls over on his partner that quickly to preserve himself?
No, I haven't. Typically, I always tell people, it's most people know better than to admit to committing murder. So, it's a difficult thing to get a confession, and it actually takes a lot of skillful interview, and a lot of times what you're actually doing is not so much hoping for a confession, which, I mean, that's what you actually would love to get, but that the odds of that aren't real good. But the primary part of any suspect interview is you're locking them into a certain statement, because they're going to lie, and they're going to make things up, and they're going to say things that a lot of times can be disproved. A lot of times will add an element to the prosecution, and probably equally as important is that it keeps them from being able to take the stand and tell a story that their attorney crafts for them later on, because they've already given this other statement. And so then you can use it for impeachment testimony. So, that's kind of the thing, but it's not very often that you get a guy that just starts, admitting to guilt and rolling over on their partner. I mean, that takes a lot of effort most of the time.
Well, so clearly, obviously, it's a true story. So it happened, and he's clearly deflecting his responsibility as much as possible on Jimmy Lee Smith, which does happen with crime partners. Even though it's hard to get a statement out of them, if you got 2 or 3 guys involved, they will look to shift responsibility and blame on the other partner. Did you found that as a homicide investigator? Do you find that to be true?
Yeah, I mean, especially once they think that you've got them, once they're convinced that you've got enough evidence, you're going to prosecute them. I had and it was a capital case. I had a woman who I needed her to admit certain things to put her in with the killers, and I was able to get her to do so. And then she started, and one of the suspects was her own son. So once she decided to go down that path, she just started, putting everything on her son and his friends, and to save herself. She thought she was saving herself, but she also, in the meantime, had given me enough that it was, a no-brainer. She was in for a dime, in for a dollar, So.
What I thought that was interesting about the shooting of Ian Campbell, and when you look at it, because I mean, obviously I had my opinion. It was Powell who took Campbell's gun, and it was Campbell's gun that was used, I think, to initially murder him. So it was likely Powell who fired all the rounds. That's what it appeared to me to be. Of course, in the movie that plays out a little differently. But the fact that he rolled over so quickly to shift blame and responsibility, well, that usually doesn't bode well when you go to prison. Either, right? So he is definitely taking a risk, but he's also a guy that is thinking of, as most criminals do, themselves, as you just talked about, right?
Self-preservation, yeah.
Yeah. So he's all about himself as much as he says he's your partner. He's all about himself. What do you think about that, Danny Kuhn?
That's true. You go back to the shooting portion of it. The initial shot was fired by Ian Campbell, by Gregory Powell. And that initial shot was a non-fatal wound. It went in, it knocked out his teeth, probably would have had a little bit of jaw and gum damage, but it was non-fatal. He went down, and one of the two pumped 4 rounds into his chest. Hettinger, he would never say it, but he believed it was probably Smith that fired the rounds. Wambaugh has alluded several times that he believes it was probably Smith that fired the rounds. And I've even when I was in college studying this, it was a sexual experience from Smith of shooting those rounds into Campbell. So it's really bizarre. We'll never know, and it's just something that's there. Unfortunately, it happened. But
so based upon that, we have 2 different suspects pointing the fingers at each other to shift blame.
Right.
If that theory is true, then Smith did do it. Then he's trying to shift all the blame onto Powell as well.
And you go to, I think it's the second or third interview that Pierce Brooks and Gregory Powell had. Powell just flat out says, "Yeah, I shot the cop. I shot him in the mouth. I did this. I did that." And Smith pumped 4 rounds into him. So he is just completely he admitted his part of the guilt, but then put everything else on Smith. And you talk about, Danny, I've had several robbery suspects, because we go out and when I was in Compton, we'd get these robbery crews and gaffle them up, and you're interviewing them, and they're doing the same thing. It goes, "I was just a driver," and they're pointing fingers at each other. I had no part of this, and it's kind of hilarious how they'll roll over on each other.
I had Tony Shapiro on a show, and he talked about how the gangsters were rolling on each other pretty quick as well.
Yeah.
So
that was a good show.
That saying, "No honor amongst thieves" is true. They'll give each other up to preserve themselves, and which is consistent with their values, right? If they had values, they wouldn't really be in the life, so to speak, right? And so it is all about themselves. Let's go on to the funeral, and then followed very quickly, Martin, by the briefing. So obviously the funeral there, we talked a little bit about the bagpipes already. And, I just want to kind of give frame for people who've never been to a police funeral. What happens is you'll get hundreds, if not thousands, of police officers come to honor a police officer. You will have bagpipes. You'll have the 21 gun salute. And I just, one of the things I noticed in the scene is the very slow folding of the flag that comes off the casket before it goes to the ground. All of this stuff it's tradition. It's things that we do for police officers who are killed in the line of duty. And it's our way of, as little as it is, at least saying thank you for your service. And, I think a lot of these processes they're for us to move past it if possible, right? And that doesn't always happen. Sometimes this can just be the symbolism that just comes back at us years later. Danny Kuhn, what do you think of that?
You talk about that Steve Owen funeral. It was held up in Lancaster. So Lancaster Baptist Church, and that church's auditorium holds 5,000. They also had 5 other campuses in the Antelope Valley that were live streaming the services, and those were all filled. outside of the service and in an overflow room at Lancaster Baptist Church. They live streamed the movie to those facilities, and they were all packed. So it would roughly, probably close to 7,000 to 10,000 people were live watching it in the Antelope Valley. Then you see it was live streamed on YouTube, I believe, and it was also in the Los Angeles area. It was broadcast live on all of the news channels, so everybody can watch. And it's kind of hard to watch, but at the same time, it's giving some closure. It's giving you, okay, this was a good guy, this was a great guy, a good cop, and it's just giving us a little bit of, it's okay, it's over with, it's done, he's gone his way to wherever he's going. And I know Steve was a Christian, so I know where he went. And it's just a little bit of closure for us.
That's ritual. I think rituals are very important for tradition and society, and we have our rituals in law enforcement. I will tell you, I'm going to have Tanya on a show next week, so Steve's wife's going to come on. I haven't picked the movie we're going to do, but I'm really excited to have her. But I think rituals are very important in law enforcement. Danny Smith, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it's also for honor. We honor them and we honor their service. And here we are the day after Memorial Day, and I think that that most people in law enforcement and the military, it's a very profound day, and the families and loved ones of those who served and those who've sacrificed, very, very heavy day. And it's that honor that makes us kind of who we are. We honor our fallen, and I think it's just a very important part of it.
The next part of our show, we're going to get into the PTSD stuff. Before I do that, though, Martin, can you put the picture of Powell and Smith up so people know who we're talking about, so they're not thinking of the characters, the actors that played them in the movie, but they're real guys. I think I sent it to you.
Yes.
Earlier.
Here it is.
Yeah, here they are. So there's Powell. He's the skinny white dude there. And then you got the black guy who's Jimmy Lee Smith. Those are the bad guys that we're talking about. And we're going to get into the PTSD stuff, and then the life of these two guys after all the court action. So let's bring up the briefings, Martin. So, the real, obviously the damage is done in the shooting for Hettinger. He manages to escape. He manages to survive this against all odds. And so his survival instinct kicks in and he survives it. But I tell you, the LAPD did not do him any favors by demanding that he go to strongly suggesting he go to these briefings and talk about what he did wrong, which is, when you're in these critical situations, you're constantly eating yourself up about what you did wrong or could have done better, even if it's not logical. I had a deputy who was shot in the face, and his ride-along was killed. And I had only been at this place for a week. There was no way as a sergeant I could have impacted how that thing played out. In fact, I'd contacted the suspect early in the evening, but everything we did was by the book. I had the guy's name in my notebook. That's how we ended up catching him. But I felt like I should have been able to do something, right? And even though it was not at all logical, there's nothing I could have done. And the interesting thing is, I agonized over every response that I did, even though the deputy was already shot, the ride-along was already killed. My tactical response, my containment, all that other stuff, I agonized every detail, and it made no sense because we caught the guy that night. We got all the evidence night. Everything was wrapped up that night. Some friends of mine later on told me that was the best run operation they had, but that didn't mean anything to me. It meant if I'd have just done better, I could have maybe prevented this, it was not logical at all. Danny Kuhn, what do you think about that? This illogical thoughts that go through your head when you're dealing with survivor's guilt or PTSD, and you may not have been there for the shooting. You're just there for the aftermath.
You're always analyzing it. It's there. It's just part of human nature. The movie, the book, the incident, it's about the post-traumatic stress survival's guilt, moral injury, and suicidal ideation. And that, for Hettinger, those issues or those scenarios that happened to him, those they just ganged up on him and overwhelmed him to a point where he couldn't function. When the watch commander told him, this is from downtown, you should go out and talk to everybody. Go to the different watch briefings and tell them how you screwed up, how you made a mistake. That was just, how can you get over that? And then the watch commander asking him, why don't you just go tell everybody it was Smith that shot him? And Hettinger goes, well, I'm not sure, 100% sure. Well, that's just like driving the knife deeper in the back of Hettinger, because now his integrity is being questioned. And with cops, real cops, honest cops, we hold our integrity at a very high level. And when someone challenges it, that's very painful. And they're asking him. He was told to admit guilt. This is how I screwed up. I gave up my gun. I screwed up this and that. And I want to read to you Police Bureau Memorandum 11, which is known as the Hettinger memo. It was written by Inspector John Power. He was a highly decorated veteran of war, and he came out with this memo shortly after just totally ostracizing the two officers. And what he wrote is, the individual officer, when taking his oath of office, enters a sacred trust to protect his community to the best of his ability, laying down his life if necessary. All men return to dust. The manner of men's living and dying is of paramount importance. Although some moderns have attempted to sap the strength and ideas of the nation's slogans such as, I'd rather be red than dead, there are situations more intolerable by death. Now, that's probably pretty much what we stand by today, because after all, law enforcement is the only profession in the United States where we're expected to die for our community. Unlike the military, they go off to foreign wars. We're here, we're in our own community, and we're expected to die for these. But that wasn't the mindset back then. And that memo, as good as it was, and as for the future, it really put another knife in the back of Carl Hettinger.
Yeah, they clearly weren't thinking about the survivor and how to best handle him in this situation. And, Danny Smith, the what ifs, I mean, we've talked a little bit about this, even as you're investigating cases, the thing about homicides, and, I will say there were a few things that I did not want to do on the sheriff's department. One of them was homicide, narcotics I didn't want to do, and I didn't want to do the SWAT team, because they can be all consuming jobs. And particularly with homicide, it's, well, if I got this one more piece of evidence, if I did this one more thing, I could deal with this tragedy. So it isn't just the situations you deal with as police officers, it's the follow-up and the pressure on you to bring justice or bring a voice for that victim that can live with you for a long time. Do you kind of agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. Especially, with any major metropolitan law enforcement agency, at homicide, you're typically understaffed and overworked. So you have a lot of unsolved cases because, quite frankly, you almost end up doing triage. You work your scene, you interview your witnesses, and you run with that case as hard as you can, as long as you can. But 6 days later, you get a fresh murder. So, and those just keep stacking up, and you keep wanting to get back to that other case, and you never stop thinking about those cases. The more tragic ones you dream about, they come to you in your sleep and wake you up. And it's a tough deal. And there were many times, I spent 2/3 of my career as a detective, and there were a lot of times I thought back to work in patrol, and at the end of the day, you close your locker and it's done. You go home, you come back with a fresh slate, and that's not the case when you're a detective. You are constantly buried. You never again will feel like you've finished everything. And if you're a guy that's kind of OCD and you like things finished, man, it wears you down. So
yeah, I think that you hit the nail on the head when you talked about major. I don't know the stats. What's the number of homicides, say LASD homicide, might handle in a year? Just give me an average.
So when I was there, we were handling between 350, 500 murders a year. And the Homicide Bureau was made up of approximately 80 investigators, divided onto 6 teams. So, the schedule, the schedule, it was quite complex, but because of the constant on-call status that you rotated in and out of, it was, there, you'd be working a couple of days, and then you'd be working all night, and then you'd have a night on the desk, and the next day you're on call for murders, and you catch one of those cases, and then you're working for 2-3 days straight with very little sleep, and next thing you know, you've got desk duty on graveyard again, and after that you're supposed to be in court the next day for a trial. Yeah, I mean, it's just it's a crazy job. It really is. It's it was extremely rewarding. I think that there was a placard that had a saying on it, and I don't remember all of it, but it talked about, that there's no greater honor or burden bestowed on a law enforcement officer than to investigate the death of a human being. And I believe that to be true. It is both, the most tremendous honor and also the greatest burden that a law enforcement officer can have.
I want to, I wasn't planning on this, but I think it's important we get into this, is the defund the police movement and the ramifications that it has on investigative units. Because when, as a chief, I could tell you, as you start to scale down on personnel because of budget cuts, those investigative units sometimes take a bigger hit than other units, and that might include homicide. You may not cut homicide, but you might cut their overtime, which reduces their effectiveness. So if you had to, based upon your expertise, if you had to give a caseload number, and a caseload is the amount of cases that it is thought that investigator or an investigative team could efficiently and effectively manage. So let's say that's the ideal caseload. What do you think the ideal caseload is versus the caseload that you had? And this is probably consistent with a lot of major law enforcement agencies in big cities. So give me the ideal, Danny Smith, and give me what you dealt with.
So the Homicide Bible, as it's often referred, a book called Homicide Investigation, and it was written by I'm going to draw a blank on the name right now. It was written many, many years ago, but I talked about this in my memoir, and I actually cited the numbers. I can't remember the numbers now off the top of my head, but it was something like, he mentioned in there that the ideal number of murders any investigator should handle in a year, as I recall, it was like four to six or something like that, because a murder case, it's just so involved. People have no clue how involved a murder case is. And when we put those cases together and present them, I mean, sometimes we have thousands of pages of reports that, between what we've written and all the reports that we've gathered from, the various other units that assist us and scientific services and everything. And you put together these murder books that sometimes could be, 300 pages, and then you could have 2, 4, 6, or 8 volumes of it. So, I mean, it's a lot of work. It's an incredible amount of work. And Vern Gerbrith, something like that, was the author. But he said that, you shouldn't be handling more than, I think it was like 4 to 6 murders a year. And he actually said in there that anyone, that thinks that they should be handling more, they're kidding themselves. And when I was at Homicide, we were easily handling, 15 to 20 murders a year. So, that gives you a perspective. I don't know what it's like today. And I would imagine that it hasn't probably changed that much.
Well, so let me let me summarize this for Dan. So we weren't in the defund the police movement at the time when Danny Smith was working, and we're in that defund the police movement now. And I need to bring up a related issue related to this. They've added, they reduced the authority of police officers, and they added to the administrative burden, which means your street cops are not out there bringing in good data and good information that helps to link one crime to another and helps to solve crimes as well. So it's becoming even harder because the typical avenues for helping to solve crimes, lots of times it comes from your street cops who are beating the bushes for you. And now it's been made a lot harder for them. They don't want them to do any traffic stops. They don't want them to talk to people. They don't want them active in those communities where the homicides are the highest, and those are communities of color. And so it's made it even harder for the investigator. And then you stack on the defund the police movement, which strips away maybe the overtime or the size of homicide bureaus. And because you're easy on crime, the homicides are going up. Danny Coons, you are a member of the community. What do you, so I'm asking you as a community member, what do you think? It's not logical what we're doing right now when it relates to law enforcement and defund the police. And Danny Smith has kind of laid out how it impacts homicides. What do you think of all that?
It's sad. The last couple of years, I've noticed that the law enforcement activity in my community. Now, I live on the border of 3 different cities. One of them is a contract city with the San Diego Sheriffs. And in all 3 cities, you don't see as much police activity as you used to see. You don't see them out making traffic stops. You don't see them doing any proactive stuff. So that's part of the defund. But the sad part on the defund the police is it's also flipped violence towards police officers. Last year, there were 60 law enforcement officers died by violence in the United States. So far this year, we're only a couple of months into the year, over 20 law enforcement officers have died by violence. Let me double check that. And that's what's sad is you're taking the authority, or you're taking the motivation out of the police officer by telling him not to do things, which then causes him to be a victim of the violence crime of the community that we're supposed to be protecting. Yeah, this year it's 22 law enforcement officers. Out of the 44 cops that have been killed in the line of duty this year, 22 are by violence. And last year, we're at 1/3, and we're not even we're just at the 1/3 part of the year. So it's sad.
If I could chime in on that, I would like to add something that I know Danny Kuhn is very well aware of. But since the topic of this show is, or one of the topics is PTSD, I think it's worth mentioning when you're talking about those stats, those statistics, that every year we have more law enforcement suicides than we have line of duty deaths. And that's the tragedy that, kind of stays beneath the surface.
Yeah, Danny Coons, I know you have some data on that. You want to give, now's the time, I think.
Yeah, okay. Last year, 169 law enforcement officers died by suicide. If you take over the last couple of years since COVID, if you take COVID out of the equation, up until last year, law enforcement suicides still outnumbered line of duty deaths. So far this year, there are 39 law enforcement suicides, and there are 44 line of duty deaths. And that's only because of the violence that the community is putting on the law enforcement. I said that 22 is by violence. Sadly, cops don't know how to drive. And a lot of the law enforcement deaths, this has been line of duty deaths. This has been facts for years. Most line of duty deaths are from traffic collisions or other preventable type accidents. This year, that is 39 police officer suicides. That equates to 1 suicide for, I think it's every 44 hours, something like that. Or every 92 hours is a law enforcement suicide.
And that doesn't include, sorry, Danny, but that doesn't include the deaths that are not actually classified as suicide, but there's a lot of cops that are suffering that go on to drink themselves to death, or die in other fashions that don't appear to be suicide, or they're not blatantly suicide, but truthfully they're probably that's what it is. So in those numbers, who knows?
Yeah, that's correct. These are just the 39. These are just what reported to an organization called Blue Help. Blue Help is a nonprofit that tracks law enforcement suicide confidentially. And I'm guesstimating that that's probably half of the number that are actually reported is what we're getting now. There was and I can't remember his name. he said a couple of years ago that the suicide rate among active and retired law enforcement is probably 4 times greater than the number that you actually see because they're not reported.
Yeah.
And because, like what Danny said, a lot of guys, when they get done with the job, or even while they're on the job, they self-medicate to the point where they die. They just give up and self-medicate, and that's it.
Well, one of our commenters says that's unacceptable, which is why I wanted to do this show, and I appreciate you guys coming on to do this particular show, because it is not out there in mass media. They're not talking about these issues. I mean, you can look 30 years ago, they used to touch on some of this stuff, but for the most part, this is glossed over. They really don't care about police officers being the victims, whether they're victims of violence by a criminal or the person takes their own life. It seems to be we've been devalued in society at this point, and that is probably contributing to the suicides and this frustration, the inability to hire folks. And I kind of want to get into let's talk about dreams and the trial never ends. Martin, let's show that clip and let's talk about this. So Danny Smith, I mean, if you're dealing with the pain of a tragic situation like Hettinger is dealing with, and it looks like he spent 6 or 7 years going to court. So in addition to having to go to briefings and talk about this, he has to testify this over and over again. And as we all know, having been witnesses on the stand, you're the target for the defense attorney. They're going to do everything they can to disrupt you. And he has an obligation not only to do his job as a citizen, but also to Ian Campbell to tell the truth. But every time it takes a little bit out of him. What do you think, Danny Smith?
Well, it takes a heck of a lot out of you. And I mean, it's similar to, victims of sexual assault. They end up becoming victims again through the justice system. But let me say this, one of the things we talked about, his briefings, having to go to the briefings and then, the numerous court appearances and just not being able to put this behind him. But they also did a reenactment at the crime scene. And interestingly, our department did a few screw ups very similar to that. And it's one of the most damaging things that you could do to a person that's been in that situation is to take them to the actual crime scene and have them walk through it again. And when I was a young deputy, we had a deputy who was involved in off-duty shooting. And that deputy, it was actually at a church, and I'm sure that I think Danny Kuhn, you probably remember it. Chief, you might also. I'm not going to mention names, but the young man was a squared away guy, and he was very religious, and his church was visiting a church in Chinatown. And he was a guy that he carried his gun everywhere he went, and he's in church and a guy walks in the back door, walks up to the front and shoots and kills the priest, and was getting ready to shoot someone else. And this deputy sheriff, off-duty deputy sheriff, took action and he put the killer down and he killed him. Well, our homicide bureau took him to do a walkthrough of the crime scene and to, explain everything that happened. And when they took him there to do that, the body was still there. The scene hadn't even been finished. The body was still there in the church. And that young guy, I'll call him a kid now. We were all kids back then, but that young man who was super squared away and had all the potential to be right up there with you, Chief, he really did. He was a sharp guy.
Yeah.
But he didn't last. He left. He couldn't hang. And I shouldn't say he couldn't hang. It damaged him so badly. He left law enforcement, and it was a tragic thing. And when I got to homicide, it was one of the things that was brought up in training. And, all these years later, they were talking about this. They said, that's something we do not do because of that case. So, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things that contribute to the PTSD and certainly in Hettinger's case, I mean, you couldn't have made it any worse for the poor guy. And it's just amazing that he was able to actually eventually thrive and do some things with his life, and that he didn't kill himself. And, clearly he was definitely suicidal and had suicidal ideation for, probably most of his life. So it's a tragic thing.
I think in this case, in him in particular, so these guys were ultimately convicted, but then it was overturned. I think, or first they were both given the death sentence, and then the death sentence was overturned, so they were given life, and then it was appealed based upon some rulings. Escobedo. It's interesting. Some of the rulings that came out were ones that we grew up as, hey, this is law, but at the time these things were. Escobedo, I think, was the right to have an attorney, if I remember correctly, and that was decided after these guys were convicted. And so, based upon the belief that these guys were not offered the right to an attorney before they gave statements, they were able to receive a new trial. I could be wrong in that, but either way, the changing case law gave them another bite at the apple. But what they did for Hettinger is it meant that he was going back to court. They've already convicted him. And now he's got to go back to court after these appeals because the conviction was overturned. And he's constantly going back, which means it's a constant reminder. And of course, he's got to go back and give testimony because that's the least he could do for Ian Campbell, right? The least he could do. But he has to then relive that over and over again, and what has been defined as his failures over and over again. Danny Kuhn, what do you think of that?
That's correct. One of probably the worst thing they did is when they bifurcated or split the trials. The original trial, that should have been it right there. Then you had the appeals. Then you had them splitting the trials apart on the retrial. And so when you split the trial, he had to say the same thing twice again in two different juries. And that's just, it was just sad to see him. When you dream, I wrote a blog on dreams. And they're basically, dreams are a real life event combined with fiction a little bit on different things. But then nightmares are dreams on steroids. And Hettinger was suffering severe nightmares. You can tell just by in the daytime when he was walking around, rubbing his neck, complaining of bad headaches. That was all part of the stress that he was under, and the dreams, that just made it worse for him.
Well, I can tell you for me, so after the Chatsworth train car crash, 25 dead, 40 seriously injured, and I interviewed all our folks there, but I can tell you, the Carson Lobby shooting, which was my first night as a watch commander, you guys probably know about that one too, and for me, I struggled to sleep well for several weeks. I didn't, once I was asleep, I wasn't woken up by dreams, but it was really hard for me for several weeks to get sleep. And I don't know if you experienced that. That was my experience. And I have to tell you, after the Chatsworth train crash, that was the first time I was there on scene till late. I was told to take over, and that, when you have 25 dead and 40 seriously injured, I mean, the breadth of the operation, it was huge, but I had to get up 4 hours later and take my daughter to college. Right. And I got up 4 hours after getting back, and I looked at the Daily News headline, and I broke down. That was the first time I actually broke down, and it took me a while to pull it back together, get a cup of coffee going, put the paper away, and not read it, and pull myself together because my daughter was getting up in a half hour, and we were heading off to the Central Coast to where she was going to college with. So I know those things happen, and it took me a long time to get over that. And then I had to interview all the guys that were there first, and their stories were horrific. And you actually live with their stories too. I imagine, Danny Smith, you probably have that. You talk to victims, and even though it's not your experience, that story now lives with you for a long time, these victim stories. Do you kind of agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, one of the things when I was diagnosed with chronic PTSD, and again, Danny Kuhn is the expert in this, but I'm sure he would agree with this assessment. They sent me to the shrink, of course, and one of the things that he explained to me after all the testing, and he said, you've got chronic PTSD, is he said it's from a culmination of violence and death and destruction over a number of years. And he said that acute PTSD is usually found in people who experience one traumatic injury or one traumatic event, where the chronic PTSD is from an accumulation. And he said that they've seen that with police officers, it's very similar to combat veterans, where they have the chronic PTSD rather than acute PTSD. And the worst thing about the chronic PTSD is it's you're not cured of it. You live with it for life. You manage it. And that was what we talked about next is how to, how to cope and manage and go on and try to thrive after. But yeah, it absolutely, the accumulation of death and destruction and violence and violent encounters, deadly encounters, those things all added up and it finally, did me in. And it took me a long time. I'll tell you this, you want to talk about dreams. Of course, back then I would have nightmares quite often, and my wife would attest to that. And it, after a few years, once I retired, I didn't have them for a long time. And then when I wrote my memoir, Nothing Left to Prove, my wife said, you're doing it again. You're having those violent dreams. And I said, yeah, I know I am. And so, you think about that, and I'm, when I wrote that book, it took me a long time to be able to actually tell those stories, and it still had this profound effect on me when I did. But, so yeah, you compare that to what they put Hettinger through, and I mean, it's just unbelievable.
So
one
Danny
crazy.
Coons, go ahead in your comment, then I got a question for you.
Oh, okay. Yeah. One thing to add on what Danny said is, I saw this stat recently where the average person in their lifetime will experience 2.1 critical incidents, actual real critical incidents in their life. The average police officer in a 20-year career will experience 600 actual critical incidents. So,
Okay.
And that's 600 times that you're just sucking it up and compartmentalizing everything, just burying it in your mind.
And Danny, that's the average police officer. I mean, there's cops.
Oh yeah,
all over the nation
that involves your little police department in the middle of nowhere. So
yeah, there's guys that never draw their gun. I mean, it's not the cops that work in areas like South Los Angeles and Detroit and Chicago and New York. I mean, it's
exactly.
Those numbers. Yeah.
Well, you probably did 602 years of Firestone yourself, because I'm sure I did that many in East LA for 4 years.
Well,
Yeah,
some of them definitely where you worked at was a wild ride, and you dealt with stuff day in and day out, and the adrenaline. I was asked to do commentary on I think it was the Tennessee, where they went into the school. The girl went into the transgender person went into the school and killed kids, and well, they had body cam footage of that, and so I did some commentary the first day. The second day, they asked me to watch the body cam, and I was watching that. And I tell you, my adrenaline was pumping. All those active shooting situations that I had been involved in or around came back to me, and I had to stop watching it and put it down for a minute and go, okay, let me do that tomorrow, because obviously it's having an impact on me today. So it does come back to you. But Danny Coons, I want to get into now. I think our inability, sometimes we think that we have the inability to manage this. And so we think we're less than a man, that somehow we think that these things impact us. I mean, in Hettinger, he dealt with impotency, he was drinking, he had memories, he started stealing, all probably related to guilt. But I think sometimes we think that we're supposed to be able to manage this without talking to people. This is what we signed up for. We're supposed to suck it up. I guess that's called toxic masculinity these days, but that's what the expectation of us then was, and to some degree, it still exists. We're just supposed to put that away and just live with it. But those hiding those things are the things that manifestate these other issues. Is that first of all, do you think having the feeling sometimes you feel like you're less than a man because you can't control those feelings, and then does that manifested itself in other ways with dreams and stealing and impotency and these other things?
Yes, it does. It's kind of weird. It's an issue that it started at the beginning of time. Men are men, and men go out and do dangerous things, and it goes back to the wars. Thousands of years we've been at war for just about almost all of the thousands of years the Earth's been here, and then it comes into the culture. And the culture of law enforcement is we're big bad deputy sheriffs, and there's nothing that's going to stop us, and nothing that's going to harm us. And at the end of the day, if you've seen something bad that happens, then you just bury it. And eventually, with Hettinger, and I've seen this with a couple of friends of mine, that they got into some incidents where it could have been different, and they started doing questionable behavior. And that's actually part of the stress, is a way of coping with stress, is you go out and you do stupid things, I'll call it, either stealing, and even Hettinger said, I just stole. I didn't keep the stuff. It's guys will go out and do dangerous activity. Guys will go out and go skydiving because they feel like, why am I survived, or why did I survive where my partner didn't? And so I'm going to go out and do stupid stuff. And it's documented that the culture, and to fix it is the culture has to change. And I read somewhere a couple months ago, the dangerous words and that can never be said is because that's the way we've always done it. And unfortunately, in government and just government in general, you hear that all the time. Well, we're doing it this way because that's the way we've always done it. So you just suck it up.
So Danny Smith, so his resignation, so we call it retirement, and he retired early, right? And the farther you get away from those situations, the farther, as you talked about it when you relived it, when you wrote your book, the farther you get away from it, it gives you time to heal if you're dealing with it in a healthy way. And I saw this as, even though it's because he was stealing, and I think the stealing was, he wanted to be punished, right? And he wanted to be caught, he wanted to be let go. But the resignation was probably the healthiest thing for him. Unfortunately, the LAPD wasn't there for him. But the resignation, I think it probably saved him. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, time and distance are the two important elements. And, he loved to garden, he loved to landscape, and that's kind of what he did for a long time. For me, I tell people I ran away from home. I took my family with me, but the first thing I did is I had to get out of Southern California. And quite frankly, I mean, it's because I can't even drive anywhere without having reminders of this murder, that murder, this case, that case. And so I left, and I had, kind of an interesting afterlife, as I like to refer to it. But, I started a second business, but I also got very involved in horses and horsemanship, which was extremely therapeutic. And then, of course, that branched into all kinds of different fun activities for quite a number of years. And between that and the writing, it really was helpful. But for me, the writing, it took a long time to be able to write the memoir. It was the fiction writing that was helpful, because in fiction, I could control the outcome of everything. And I think that was an element of why I enjoyed, or why the writing novels was so therapeutic, because I'm in a controlled environment. I can control the outcome of everything that's going to happen, and there's no repercussions to whatever I do. Yeah. So that was for me, that was kind of the escape.
It's interesting that you say time and distance. So anybody who's in law enforcement understand that those things you're taught on officer safety situations, the more distance you have away with somebody, from somebody's armed with a knife or a gun, the more time you have to react. And so it's kind of funny that you use those same verbiage to talk about time and distance away from law enforcement to help recover yourself. It's kind of an officer safety thing. I would say time and distance, and probably add to that recognition that you have an issue and you need to deal with it, right? And hopefully that helps.
Yeah, recognition is absolutely critical. And I think that a lot of the guys that end up committing suicide probably they don't come to terms with it. And there's a number of things that were offered to me for moving forward and coping. And I had an interesting conversation with my shrink and kind of laid out a plan, and he said, I think that's excellent, go forward, and also you should write for a living. He's the one that actually told me I should be a writer, but that's a whole other story.
All right. You know, we have one more theme we want to get into, but I want Danny Kuhn to go ahead and comment because I'm sure he wants to say something on this.
I forgot what the question was.
Oh yeah. Do you feel like less than a man because you can't deal with this in a way that maybe?
Yeah. We talked about it, and that is true. It's just changing the culture will fix it. Changing the attitudes, stomping the stigma about mental health issues in general. Just educating. First, we have to start with the management and work its way down. Like I said, we are lucky because we had psychological services, which did a pretty good job. But
they did expect executives. They expected executives to go there and talk there and make sure guys are okay. And I know I've done that on multiple occasions to check with guys and push them to go get counseling. I mean, I'll admit I wasn't a guy who did it myself, but I recognized it was important for other folks to go. And so, yeah, you know, I don't want to cut you off, Danny, but we have one more theme that I really got to get into. And this is Jimmy Lee Smith gets released after 19 years in custody. And then he goes on to be arrested on multiple occasions after he's released. And the reason I really wanted to get in this with you guys is, you know, when in the 80s and 90s, and I throw this stat out here, in 1993, we had 13.1 homicides per 100,000, as Danny Smith could probably attest to. By 2014, and this is in California, by 2014, we're down to 4.4, and that was the year we passed Prop 47, and now we're spiking back up to about 6.8 in California per 100,000. In LA, you could probably double that number, and that's how many you had per 100,000. So it was off the hook. But the reason why we passed 3 strikes is because we knew that there were a small number of people out there who were committing incredibly violent crime. And Jimmy Lee Smith was kind of the poster boy for this. He manages to duck out of the death penalty because of the ruling in 72. He manages to get appealed. He gets Powell to on the stand and takes the 5th, which benefits him because now he can suggest that he wasn't the guy who did the shooter. And so he gets life with the ability of parole, and he gets out on parole. And then he's arrested over the next several years. He died in, let's see, I think it was
Wayside.
Wayside. Yeah, no, which is perfect place for him to.
Yeah. April 6th, 2007.
So, but he was arrested multiple times, some of them for violent crimes, and he kept getting back out again. And it was guys like him and Richard Allen Davis and the Poly class case that really inspired 3 strikes. That's why it came about. You know, we have this narrative out there that was really done to oppress certain communities. No, it was about putting criminals in jail. And when you do the math, if we had 13.1 before 3 strikes per 100,000 in California, and we go down to 4.4, and then we change the laws and it's going back, how many lives did we actually save with 3 strikes? We probably could have done things some better on mass incarceration, but Smith ended up kind of being a poster boy for that revolving door at the time. Danny Smith, what do you think of that comment?
Well, you're right. It's interesting when the 3 strikes law came out, you know, of course, there's a lot of controversy and people were like, oh yeah, a guy's going to spend the rest of his life in prison for taking a piece of pizza. You know, I remember one case, I think it was down in Huntington Beach or something on the pier. And, you know, that's not the actual truth. And you mentioned it earlier, Chief, when you first introduced this show, that most of these guys, it takes, you know, 6, 7, 8, 10 arrests and convictions before anyone ever goes to prison. You know, most of the guys that I would deal with had rap sheets that were, you know, 20 pages long, and you just go through and it's diversion after diversion after diversion, and then probation, and then probation on probation, and probation on probation on probation. You know, it's like they did everything they could to not make a guy go to prison. So, you know, in the case with the thug that took a piece of pizza from a little kid on the pier, you know, that wasn't just he stole a piece of pizza. No, he robbed a child with force and fear. This is a predator. This guy had all of these other felony convictions, which meant he probably had, you know, 20 times that many arrests. So, the 3-strike law, what it actually did, and it was very effective. And, as you said, the numbers speak for itself, but it took predators, the most hardcore predators, and it put them away. It locked them up, and it was a damn good thing,
Well, I need to say what I'm all about. One of the things I've done is I do work on anti-recidivism programs. I sit on an advisory board. We focus on that. And I do believe that we could have done more in the area of corrections, and we didn't do that. But you don't throw out good policies that have helped lower crime because the disparities don't fit your numbers. Because actually, if you look at disparity, when you lower the crime in communities of color where there was most of the homicides were at, businesses moved in, hope moved in, jobs happened, people progressed in life. Now that those crime are going back up in those communities and businesses are moving out and hope is leaving. So we could have tweaked the criminal justice system versus just burning it all down, which is what the advocates are talking about now. Danny Kuhn, I know you want to talk about this a little bit, so give me your thoughts on this stuff.
It all goes back to what we were talking about, defund the police. Back when Lee Baca first became sheriff, he actually came up with some pretty good programs. He realized that education was important, and he learned that most of the people in the county jail system was somewhere around like a junior high education, middle school type education. So he started programs up at NCCF, North County Correctional Facility, of getting people in and getting their GEDs. He also started a boot camp type program for younger inmates to go through to educate them and to redirect their lives out of the recidivism. And then lastly, he had a program at Biscaloo Center. Everybody always remembers the koi fish. That was more or less like a domestic violence education program. And those were actually all very successful until the Board of Supervisors decided, well, we're going to cut the sheriff's budget this year by $500 million. And the first thing that got cut is those programs.
Yes.
We have to
wrap it up.
Is upon us. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, can I throw a couple of things in real quick?
Sure.
Come on.
Carl Hettinger, he did live a successful life. He worked out in a nursery somewhere in about 83 or 84. He worked as an aide to the Kern County Board of Supervisors. In 1987, he was appointed to the Board of Supervisors in Kern County. Unfortunately, on May 4th, 1994, he died of liver failure. He was 59. Jimmy Lee Smith, he was first paroled in 82 and spent the last 25 years of his life in and out of prison. He died on April 6, 2007 at the age of 76 at Wayside. And then Gregory Powell, he never got out of jail, thank goodness. He died in Vacaville at 79 years old in August of 2012. And so guys, that's the sad part is Hettinger, sadly, he didn't die in the onion field that night. He spent another 30 agonizing years reliving this thing over and over and slowly self-medicated himself to death.
All right, guys, thank you so much for joining me. Stick around for a debrief afterwards. And thank you, folks, for listening to our show. Martin, take it away.
Thanks.
Those sons of bitches. Ma, I'm doing a show.